The year was 1888, and the wind across the plains carried the memory of a winter that had refused to die. It scraped at the weathered planks of Arthur Vance's farmhouse, a lonely sound for a lonely man. For 5 years, since the fever had taken his Martha and their little boy, silence had been his most constant companion. It sat with him at the dinner table, a hollow space across from his own chair. It walked with him through the fields he tilled, a ghost at his shoulder. He had grown accustomed to its weight, the way a man grows accustomed to a chronic ache. His life was a metronome of necessity. Rise with the pale light, tend the stock, mend the fences, work the soil, eat, sleep, and rise again. The farm was his anchor and his prison, a sprawling 200 acres of earth that held the entirety of his world. He had built the house with his own hands for Martha. He had cleared the fields with dreams of a future that now lay buried on the small grassy hillock behind the cottonwoods, marked by 2 simple wooden crosses he could see from his bedroom window. Grief had not so much broken him as it had scoured him clean of softness, leaving a man as hard and unyielding as the winter-frozen ground. On a night in late April, the sky broke open. A storm, violent and sudden, clawed at the prairie. Rain fell not in sheets but in solid, wind-driven walls, and lightning split the darkness with jagged, incandescent seams. Arthur sat by the cold hearth, watching the storm through the wavy glass of his window, the book in his lap long forgotten. He was not afraid of the storm's fury. It felt like a fitting echo of the tempest that had long ago settled inside his own chest. It was then that he saw a flicker of orange against the bruised purple of the horizon, miles to the east, where the old trader's road wound toward the distant town of Redemption. It was not lightning. This light was frantic, alive, a terrible dancing bloom of destruction, fire. Something stirred in him, an impulse older and deeper than the calloused shell of his grief. He pulled on his oilskin coat and heavy boots, his movements methodical, driven by an instinct he thought had withered away. He saddled his steadiest horse, a big roan gelding that stood unfazed by the thunder, and rode out into the maelstrom. The rain was a physical blow, cold and relentless, plastering his hair to his skull and soaking through the seams of his coat. He kept his eyes fixed on the hellish glow, a beacon in the tempest. He found what was left of it an hour later. A carriage, or what had been one, lay splintered and overturned at the bottom of a shallow ravine, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. It must have slid from the muddy track. A dead horse, its neck bent at an unnatural angle, lay in the traces. The carriage itself was engulfed in flames, the fire hissing and spitting as the rain fought a losing battle against it. It was a scene of utter devastation, another tragedy for the unforgiving land to swallow. Arthur was about to turn back, to leave the dead to the storm, when he heard it. A sound so faint it was nearly lost beneath the howl of the window-low, human moan. He slid from his horse, his boots sinking into the thick, cloying mud. He approached the wreckage cautiously, the heat of the fire a blast against his face. The moan came again, from inside the burning chassis. Without a second thought for his own safety, he tore at the splintered door, his hands heedless of the gouging wood. He ripped it free and plunged into the smoke-choked interior. And there she was, a woman slumped on the floor, her fine traveling dress torn and smudged with soot. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had come loose and framed a face pale as milk. One side of her dress was smoldering. He batted the embers out with his gloved hands, then gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against the solid wall of his chest. He carried her out of the inferno just as the roof of the carriage collapsed inward with a great, whooshing roar, sending a fountain of sparks into the tumultuous sky. He laid her gently on a patch of wet grass, away from the blaze. She was unconscious, a bloody gash on her temple and a raw-looking burn on her forearm where the fire had kissed her. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter of life in the midst of death and destruction. He looked at her face. Even in its stillness and injury, he could see a fragile beauty, a delicacy that did not belong in this harsh, brutal landscape. He glanced around. There was no one else. No driver, no other passengers, just the dead horse, the burning wreck, and this woman, a piece of flotsam cast up by the storm. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her with him was a complication he did not want. The quiet, ordered solitude of his life was about to be shattered. He looked down at her still form, at the rain washing the grime from her pale cheeks, and knew there was no choice. He had not been able to save his wife. He had not been able to save his son. He would not leave another soul to perish on his watch. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Arthur lifted her again and carried her to his horse, pulling her up to sit in front of him. He wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her securely against him, and turned the roan for home, leaving the fire to burn itself out in the rain. She awoke to the scent of wood smoke and lavender. The world swam into focus slowly, a blurry watercolor of rough-hewn ceiling beams and a patchwork quilt. A dull, throbbing pain emanated from her head, and her arms stung with a fierce, localized fire. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back against a lumpy pillow. "Be still." The voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. It came from the shadows in the corner of the small Spartan room. A man emerged from the gloom, stepping into the weak morning light that filtered through a single window. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a landscape of hard lines and angles, weathered by sun and sorrow. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no discernible expression. He held a steaming mug in one large, calloused hand. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "My farm," he answered, his tone flat, offering no more than the basic fact. "You were in a carriage accident. On the Traders' Road. I found you." Her memory returned in a rush of terrifying images, the lurch of the carriage, the shriek of splintering wood, the scream of the horse, the suffocating heat and smoke. She remembered the terror, the certainty of her own death. The driver. Dead. The word was stark, devoid of pity. You were alone. She absorbed this, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. Alone. She was truly alone now. She looked down at herself and realized she was wearing a simple white cotton nightgown, far too large for her. It was clean and smelled faintly of soap and the dried flowers she'd scented upon waking. Her own fine dress was gone. "Your clothes were ruined," he said, seeming to read her mind. "Burned." He gestured to a small table beside the bed. "There's water and broth when you feel up to it." He placed the mug on the table and turned to leave. "Wait," she called out, her voice a little stronger. "Thank you. You saved my life." He paused at the door but didn't turn around. He merely grunted in acknowledgement, a sound that could have meant anything, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the silence of the house and the storm of her own thoughts. Her name was Clara Prescott, and she was a runaway. Now, it seemed, she was also a survivor, indebted to a grim, silent stranger who looked at her as if she were nothing more than a stray animal he'd reluctantly brought in from the cold. The first few days passed in a haze of pain and wary observation. Arthur Shea had learned his name from a brief, clipped exchange attended to her injuries with an unnerving, impersonal efficiency. He cleaned and dressed the burn on her arm and the cut on her head without a wasted motion or a single word of comfort. His touch was firm, yet surprisingly gentle. The touch of a man accustomed to handling fragile things, though he himself seemed anything but. He would bring her food, simple broth, then stew and bread, and leave it on the bedside table. He never stayed to talk. The house was quiet. The only sounds, the creak of floorboards, the distant lowing of a cow, and the ticking of a mantel clock in the other room. Clara spent the hours listening, trying to piece together the life of the man who had rescued her. The house was meticulously clean but stark, stripped of any ornamentation save for a single faded photograph on the mantel of a smiling woman holding a small child. The sight of it sent a pang of understanding through her. This was not a house of solitude, it was a house of loss. When she was strong enough to leave the bed, she explored the small cabin. It consisted of the main room, which served as kitchen and living space, and the bedroom she occupied. His own bed was a simple cot near the hearth. Everything was functional, practical, worn with use. It was the home of a man who expected nothing from life but the work of his own two hands. Clara felt a growing sense of obligation, a need to be more than just a burden. Her father, a man who measured all things in terms of value and debt, had taught her that nothing was ever given freely. "I want to help," she announced one morning, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the kitchen as he washed the breakfast dishes. Arthur glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You're not well enough." "I am," she insisted, her chin lifting with a stubbornness that surprised even herself. "I can't just lie there like a useless invalid. Please, let me earn my keep." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her soft, uncalloused hands, her bearing that spoke of a life far removed from manual labor. A flicker of something disdain, perhaps, or pity crossed his face before it was gone. He sighed, a sound of deep weariness, and gestured with a wet hand toward a pile of his mending. "The needle and thread are in the tin box on the shelf." It was a start. Clara sat in a wooden chair by the window, the rough fabric of his work shirt awkward in her hands. Her own sewing had always been delicate embroidery on fine linen, not patching the torn knee of denim trousers. Her first stitches were clumsy, uneven. She pricked her finger, swearing softly under her breath. From across the room, she felt his eyes on her, observing, judging. But he said nothing. He simply went back to his work, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Slowly, a new routine began to form, weaving their two solitary existences together. She proved more capable than he had expected. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands growing tougher. She fed the chickens, scattering the grain with a tentative grace. She learned the rhythms of his life, the quiet competence with which he moved through his days. In the evenings, they would sit at the small wooden table and eat their meal in silence. But gradually, the silence changed. It lost its sharp, tense edge and softened into something more comfortable, a shared space rather than an empty one. One night, a nightmare wrenched her from sleep. She awoke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom touch of her fiancé's cruel hands on her skin. She sat up, trembling, trying to shake the lingering terror. The bedroom door creaked open. Arthur stood there, a silhouette against the faint moonlight. "You were crying out," he said, his voice low. She couldn't speak, merely nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a cup of water. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was warm, solid, a grounding anchor in the turmoil of her fear. "Bad dreams," she managed to say, her voice shaky. He lingered in the doorway, not leaving as he usually did. "I get them too," he admitted, the words so quiet she barely heard them. It was the first crack in his formidable armor, the first hint of the man beneath the stoic facade. She looked toward the photograph on the mantel in the other room, its subjects obscured by the darkness. "Your wife?" she asked gently. He was silent for a long time. "And my son," he said finally, his voice thick with an ancient pain. "Fever, 5 years ago." "I'm so sorry, Arthur." The words felt small, inadequate, but they were all she had. He gave a curt nod and retreated, closing the door softly behind him. But something had shifted between them. He had shared his wound, and in doing so, had made space for hers. The next day, as they worked side by side in the garden, she found herself telling him about her home in the East. Not the whole truth, but pieces of it, the stifling expectations, the gilded cage, the man her father had commanded her to marry. She spoke of a life of suffocating control, and he listened, his silence no longer one of indifference, but of understanding. He saw the steel beneath her delicate exterior, and she began to see the deep well of kindness beneath his grief-hardened shell. The lonely farmhouse was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The sanctuary, however, was fragile. A month after her arrival, their supply of flour and salt ran low. Redemption was a day's ride away, a necessary trip that Arthur could no longer postpone. A knot of anxiety tightened in Clara's stomach at the thought of being left alone, but she hid it, knowing he had no choice. "I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow," he said, his voice gruff as he packed his saddlebags. He avoided looking at her, his movements stiff. The prospect of leaving seemed to unsettle him as much as it did her. "Keep the door bolted. Don't open it for anyone." "I won't," she promised. He finally turned to face her, his gaze intense. "I mean it, Clara. Anyone." She watched him ride away, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast expanse of the prairie, until he was just a speck on the horizon. The silence he left behind was the old kind, the heavy, empty kind she remembered from her first days there. The house felt too big, the plains too quiet. She bolted the door as he had instructed and tried to lose herself in chores, but a pervasive sense of dread followed her throughout the day. In Redemption, Arthur moved through the general store with his usual efficiency, gathering his supplies. The town was a small, dusty affair, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the endless sky. It was a place of gossip and judgment, which was why he so rarely visited. As he paid the proprietor, his eyes fell upon a piece of paper tacked to the wall beside the door, a notice he hadn't seen on his last visit. His blood ran cold. It was a bounty poster, a skillfully rendered sketch of a woman's face stared back at him, a face he knew as well as his own. It was Clara. The text below the image was stark and brutal. Wanted, for return to her legal guardian, $1,000 reward. It named her Clara Prescott. It described her as the daughter of a prominent industrialist from Philadelphia. And then came the insidious part, the words designed to strip her of credibility and sympathy. The subject is of a delicate constitution and prone to fits of hysteria and fanciful delusions. She is to be considered a runaway and returned, with or without her consent, to the custody of her father, Mr. Elias Prescott. Information to be directed to the Pinkerton Detective Agency office in Denver. $1,000. It was a fortune. More money than Arthur had seen in his entire life. It was enough to hire help for the farm, to buy better livestock, to live without the constant, grinding worry of making ends meet. It was a way out. All he had to do was send a wire to Denver. A sour taste rose in his throat. He thought of Clara, her quiet strength, the terror in her eyes when she awoke from her nightmares, the way her laughter, a rare and precious sound, had begun to fill the empty spaces in his home. He thought of the words on the poster delusions. It was a lie, a cruel and calculated effort to paint her as a madwoman, to invalidate her story before she even had a chance to tell it. This wasn't a search for a beloved, lost daughter. It was the hunt for an escaped piece of property. He ripped the poster from the wall, crumpling it in his fist. The storekeeper looked at him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Know her?" the man asked, craning his neck. "No," Arthur growled, his voice a low threat. "Just tired of seeing this trash cluttering up the town." He threw the coins for his supplies onto the counter and strode out of the store, the crumpled paper a hot brand in his hand. The ride home was a torment of conflicting thoughts. The money was a powerful lure, a siren song promising an easier life, but turning her in would mean sending her back to the cage she had so desperately fled. It would mean becoming a part of the cruelty she was running from. By the time he saw the familiar silhouette of his farmhouse against the setting sun, he knew what he had to do. He also knew that his life, and hers, had just become infinitely more dangerous. He found her in the main room, pacing nervously. The relief on her face when she saw him was so palpable, it struck him like a physical blow. He said nothing, simply dropping his saddlebags to the floor. He walked to the table and smoothed out the crumpled bounty poster, its damning words stark in the lamplight. Clara froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her ashen. She stared at the paper, at the sketch of her own face, at the lies printed beneath it. Her breath hitched, a small, wounded sound. "You should have told me," Arthur said, his voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She met his gaze, her own filled with a mixture of terror and defiance. "Would you have believed me?" she challenged. "Or would you have believed the $1,000? "I'm asking you now," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Tell me the truth." And so she did. The whole story poured out of her, a torrent of pain and desperation held back for too long. She spoke of her father, Elias Prescott, a man who saw her not as a daughter but as an asset, a pawn to be used in his relentless pursuit of power and wealth. She described the man he had arranged for her to marry, a business partner named Mr. Shaw, a man twice her age with cold, predatory eyes and a reputation for cruelty. The marriage was a business merger, and she was the final clause in the contract. "He locked me in my room when I refused," she whispered, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "He told me I would learn to be an obedient wife. I knew he would break me. So I ran. I took what jewelry I could hide and paid a driver to take me west, as far as the money would go. I didn't know where I was going, just away." Arthur listened, his expression unchanging, but something in his eyes softened. He saw not the hysterical runaway from the poster, but a cornered woman fighting for her life with the only weapons she had, courage and desperation. He saw the same trapped look he sometimes saw in the eyes of wild things caught in a snare. When she finished, a heavy silence fell between them. The bounty poster on the table seemed to mock them, a testament to the power and reach of the man she had fled. "They will find me," she said, her voice devoid of hope. "My father never gives up on what he considers his." Arthur looked from her terrified face to the poster. The choice was laid bare before him. He could have safety and security, or he could have her. He could return to his solitary, empty life, or he could stand and fight for the woman who had inadvertently brought life back into his home. He reached out and slowly, deliberately, took the poster. He walked to the hearth where the fire burned low and tossed it into the embers. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the image of her face and the promise of a reward consumed by the flames. "Let them come," Arthur said, his voice a low growl of defiance. He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw not just a protector, but a partner. "This is my land. They are not welcome here." The waiting was the hardest part. The days that followed were thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. They worked together, preparing. Arthur cleaned and oiled his rifle and the old shotgun that had belonged to his father. He showed Clara how to load and fire the shotgun, her hands surprisingly steady as she learned. They reinforced the doors and shuttered the windows at night, turning the small farmhouse into a makeshift fortress. In this crucible of shared fear, the last of their barriers crumbled. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts, their lost dreams. He told her about Martha, about her easy laugh, and the way she'd loved the wildflowers that grew by the creek. He spoke of his son, Thomas, a boy with his mother's smile and a boundless curiosity. Clara listened, her heart aching for his loss, and she, in turn, told him of her own quiet dreams of opening a small bookshop, of a life where she could make her own choices, however small. They were two broken people finding solace in each other's jagged edges. One evening, as a chill wind rattled the windows, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. They came at dusk 3 weeks later. Arthur saw them first, 3 riders silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. They were not moving like ordinary travelers. They moved with the grim purpose of wolves closing in on their prey. "They're here," he said, his voice calm, but Clara saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Go to the bedroom, bar the door, keep the shotgun with you. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not hiding. I'm not a child to be protected. We do this together." He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes, but also a fierce resolve he had come to admire. He gave a single sharp nod. "All right, together." The riders reined in their horses 100 yards from the house. One of them, a man with a narrow, cruel face and a long duster, dismounted and walked forward, his hands held away from the pistols at his hips in a false show of peace. "Arthur Vance," the man called out, his voice carrying on the still evening air. "My name is Donovan. I have business with the woman you're sheltering." Arthur stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. "There's no woman here by the name on your poster," he called back, his voice steady. "You're on private property. I suggest you leave." Donovan laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. $1,000 says you're lying. Mr. Prescott is a very powerful man. He wants his daughter back. He doesn't much care in what condition. We can do this the easy way, farmer, or the hard way. It's no concern of mine either way. "The only way you're leaving this farm is the way you came," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Turn around and ride out." Donovan's smile vanished. He spat on the ground. "Hard way it is." He drew his pistol with blinding speed, but Arthur was ready. He dropped behind the porch railing, just as a shot splintered the wood where his head had been. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of chaos, smoke, and the deafening roar of gunfire. The two other bounty hunters spread out, trying to flank the house. Arthur returned fire, his shots measured and precise, using the cover of the porch to his advantage. Inside, Clara moved quickly, barricading the back door with a heavy chest, her fear replaced by a cold, focused adrenaline. One of the men made a run for the barn. Arthur fired, but the man was too fast, disappearing into the shadows. A moment later, a flickering orange light appeared in the barn's hayloft. "He's trying to burn us out," Arthur yelled. Clara's heart seized. Not this again, not another fire. But this time, she was not a helpless victim. She grabbed the shotgun, her hands no longer trembling, and ran to the back window. She saw the second bounty hunter creeping along the side of the house, trying to get to a window. Taking a deep breath, just as Arthur had shown her, she aimed and pulled the trigger. The shotgun bucked hard against her shoulder, and the man screamed, clutching his leg as the buckshot tore through it. He scrambled away, dragging himself back toward the horses. Outside, Arthur saw his chance. With one man down and the other busy setting the fire, only Donovan was left. He vaulted over the railing and sprinted for the cover of the water trough, firing at the barn as he ran. Donovan emerged from the barn, firing back, the bullets kicking up dirt around Arthur's feet. They were locked in a desperate duel. Arthur felt a searing pain in his side and stumbled, his vision blurring for a second. A bullet had grazed his ribs. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the hot slick of blood spreading across his shirt, and raised his rifle. He fired just as Donovan was taking aim again. The shot was true. Donovan cried out, dropping his pistol as he clutched a shattered shoulder and staggered back. Seeing his two men out of the fight and himself wounded, the bounty hunter's resolve broke. He cursed, turned, and fled with his injured men, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the barn and Arthur's ragged breathing. Clara rushed out onto the porch. "Arthur, you're hurt." He waved her off, his eyes fixed on the burning barn. "It's just a graze, the barn." They worked together, using buckets from the well to fight the flames. The fire had not yet taken full hold, and they managed to douse it before it could consume the structure that held his livestock and his livelihood. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and bleeding, they finally leaned against the barn wall, the immediate danger past. In the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the evidence of their desperate fight, they looked at each other. The space between them was charged with everything that had just happened, everything they had survived. He had been willing to die for her. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. Without a word, Clara stepped forward and gently touched the torn, bloody fabric on his side. He flinched, then stood still under her touch. "We have to clean this," she said, her voice soft. Inside, by the warm glow of the lamp, she carefully cleaned and bandaged his wound. Her touch was tender, her movements gentle. The last of his defenses, the final wall around his heart, crumbled into dust. He looked at her, at the soot smudged on her cheek and the fierce loyalty shining in her eyes, and saw not a complication or a burden, but the missing piece of his own soul. He reached up and gently brushed the smudge from her face with his thumb. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with a deep, unwavering affection that mirrored his own. The battle for the farm was over, but in its place, a new, quieter, and far more profound understanding had been forged. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were partners, survivors, who had chosen to stand as one. Peace, when it came, was not a grand pronouncement, but a quiet settling, like dust after a storm. In the days following the attack, a new equilibrium took hold in the small farmhouse. The physical wounds began to heal. The angry red line on Arthur's side slowly faded, and the bruises on Clara's shoulder from the shotgun's kick turned from purple to a faint yellow. But it was the healing of the deeper wounds that truly transformed the space they shared. The silence that returned to the house was no longer empty or tense. It was a comfortable, living thing, filled with the quiet rhythm of two people who now belonged together. They both knew, however, that this peace was temporary. Elias Prescott was not a man to be thwarted so easily. The bounty on Clara's head remained. Donovan and his men were gone, but others would inevitably follow. The farm, once Arthur's sanctuary of grief and then their shared fortress, had become a liability, a fixed point on a map for their enemies to find. The decision was unspoken at first, a shared understanding that passed between them in lingering glances and the somber quiet of the evenings. It was Arthur who finally gave it voice one night as they sat on the porch, watching the stars prick the vast black canvas of the sky. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. Clara looked at the house, at the fields stretching out in the moonlight. It was the first place she had ever felt safe, the first place she had ever felt seen for who she truly was. But she knew he was right. "Where will we go?" "West," he answered, a direction that was less a place and more a promise. "Further west, Oregon maybe. A place where a man and his wife can start over, where names don't matter as much as the work of your hands." He paused, then turned to her, his gaze serious. "If that's what you want." The word hung in the air between them, wife. It was not a question of passion, but a statement of fact, of a commitment forged in fire and fear. It was an offering of a future, a shared destiny. A slow smile spread across Clara's face, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said softly, "that's what I want." They spent the next 2 days preparing to leave. The process was a quiet dismantling of Arthur's old life. He sold his cattle and most of his tools to a neighboring farmer, a man who asked few questions and respected Arthur's privacy. The price was low, but the transaction was swift. They packed what they could fit into a sturdy wagon he acquired: essential tools, preserved food, a few blankets, and the small tin box that held Martha's sewing things. Clara added the only thing she had left of her old life, a small leather-bound volume of poetry. On their last evening, Arthur walked alone to the 2 wooden crosses on the hill behind the cottonwoods. He stood there for a long time as the sun set, the sky painted in hues of orange and rose. He was not saying goodbye, he realized, but thank you. For years, this place had been a monument to all he had lost. But now, it was simply a memory, a part of a past he could finally carry with him instead of being buried by it. He was leaving the ghost of the man he had been behind. As dawn broke the next morning, casting a pale, hopeful light over the prairie, they climbed into the wagon. Arthur took the reins, and Clara sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. He looked at her, at the woman who had crashed into his life like a bolt of lightning, burning down the walls of his solitude and planting something new in the ashes. She had run from a life of gilded captivity, and he had been running from life itself. Now they were running towards something, together. He clucked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels leaving deep tracks in the soil of the farm. He was leaving forever. He did not look back. His home was no longer a place of wood and earth. It was the resilient, courageous woman sitting beside him. They were two solitary souls heading west into an uncertain future, but they were no longer alone. And in the vast, unforgiving heart of the American frontier, that was more than enough. It was everything.